The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the rehearsal room where 3 generations of royalty gathered. Prince William stood at the front, his posture rigid with the weight of responsibility that had settled on his shoulders since becoming heir apparent. Behind him, King Charles observed quietly, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, while 10-year-old Prince George sat cross-legged on a velvet cushion, his school uniform slightly wrinkled from the early morning rush. The rehearsal was for the upcoming state dinner, an event that would host dignitaries from 12 nations. Every detail had to be perfect, every movement rehearsed until it became second nature. William had been preparing for such moments his entire life, but the pressure felt different now that he was training his own son to follow in these ancient footsteps. "Remember, George," William said, turning to face his eldest child, "when you greet the ambassador from France, you must bow exactly like this." He demonstrated a precise, measured bow that spoke of years of diplomatic protocol training. The angle must be respectful but not subservient. "You represent not just our family, but our nation." George watched his father with intelligent blue eyes that seemed far too wise for his young face. The boy had been attending these rehearsals for months now, gradually being introduced to the complex world of royal duties that would one day be his burden to bear. Unlike his younger siblings, Charlotte and Louis, who could still enjoy the relative freedom of childhood, George was already being shaped by the expectations of kingship. "I understand, Papa," George replied, his voice clear and confident. "But, what if I make a mistake? What if I forget the proper protocol?" William's expression softened slightly. He knelt down to his son's level, placing gentle hands on the boy's shoulders. "Then, you apologize gracefully and move forward. The most important thing is sincerity, George. People can forgive a protocol mistake if they see genuine respect and kindness." King Charles stepped forward, his grandfather's instincts overriding royal formality. "Your father is right, young man. I've made my share of errors over the decades, and the world didn't end. What matters is learning from each experience." The rehearsal continued with various scenarios being practiced. George walked through receiving lines, learned the proper way to introduce dignitaries to one another, and practiced the subtle art of royal conversation, engaging enough to show interest, but careful not to express political opinions. His tutors had prepared him well academically, but this was education of a different sort entirely. As they moved through the exercises, William found himself watching his son with a mixture of pride and concern. George handled each task with remarkable composure, but William could see the weight of expectation in the boy's slightly hunched shoulders, in the way he carefully considered each word before speaking. It reminded William painfully of his own childhood, when every public appearance was scrutinized, every gesture analyzed for meaning. "Now," William announced, checking his watch, "we'll practice the receiving line for tomorrow evening's dinner. George, you'll stand between your grandfather and me. Remember to smile, but not too broadly. Make eye contact, offer a firm handshake, and speak clearly." They arranged themselves in formation, with staff members playing the roles of various dignitaries. The first few practice rounds went smoothly, with George performing each greeting with precision. But, as they continued, William noticed his son's energy flagging. The boy's smile became forced, his posture less natural. "George, straighten your shoulders," William corrected, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned from years of royal training. "And, remember to project your voice. The ambassador from Germany shouldn't have to strain to hear you." George complied immediately, but something flickered in his expression, a brief shadow that spoke of frustration or perhaps fatigue. Charles noticed it too, his grandfather's intuition picking up on the subtle change in the boy's demeanor. "Perhaps we should take a short break," Charles suggested gently. "Even the most dedicated students need time to absorb their lessons." William glanced at his father, then, at his watch. "We have limited time before tomorrow's event. George needs to be absolutely prepared." "I am prepared, Papa," George said quietly, but there was something in his tone that made both men pause. I've been practicing for weeks. I know the protocols, I know the names of all the dignitaries, and I know how important this is for our family and our country. There was a maturity in his words that caught William off guard. Sometimes he forgot that his son was growing up in an age of instant information, where royal children had access to news and social media discussions about their family that previous generations never encountered. George wasn't just learning protocol, he was developing his own understanding of what royal service meant in the modern world. The afternoon wore on with more practice sessions. They rehearsed walking to their seats, the proper order of precedence, and even practiced eating with the formal silverware that would be used. George absorbed each lesson with the same focused attention he brought to his mathematics homework, but William could sense an underlying tension building. As the sun began to set, painting the rehearsal room in golden hues, they moved on to practicing formal conversations. William had prepared a list of safe topics that George could discuss with various guests: the weather, school subjects, sports he enjoyed, and questions he could ask about other countries' customs. Remember, William instructed, if someone asks you about current political events or controversial topics, you deflect gracefully. You might say, "That's a very interesting question. Perhaps you could share your thoughts with my father, who is much better informed about such matters than I am." George nodded, but his brow furrowed slightly. What if they ask me something I genuinely want to know about? What if the ambassador from Japan mentions their space program, and I want to learn more about it? William paused, considering the question. It was a good one, reflecting the curious mind that made George such an engaging child. But royal duties required balancing personal interests with diplomatic caution. Then, you express sincere interest while being careful not to make any statements that could be interpreted as government policy, William explained. You could say, "I find space exploration fascinating. I'd love to hear more about Japan's achievements in that field." The boy practiced these diplomatic phrasings, his natural enthusiasm carefully modulated into appropriate royal responses. Watching him, William felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride at how quickly George was mastering these difficult skills, but also a deep sadness for the spontaneity and simple pleasures of childhood that were inevitably being sacrificed on the altar of royal duty. As evening approached, the rehearsals grew more intense. William had arranged for actual embassy staff to attend, creating as realistic a simulation as possible. George would meet real diplomats, practice real conversations, and receive feedback on his performance. It was comprehensive preparation, but it was also overwhelming for a 10-year-old who had started his day with ordinary arithmetic lessons. The boy's fatigue was becoming more apparent. His responses, while still correct, lacked the natural warmth that usually characterized his interactions. His smile had become practiced rather than genuine, and his posture, while perfect, seemed stiff and uncomfortable. "George," William said during a brief pause between practice sessions, "tomorrow night will be wonderful. You'll meet fascinating people from around the world, hear different languages, and learn about cultures we've only read about in books. Try to focus on the excitement of that rather than the pressure of protocol." George looked up at his father with those perceptive blue eyes. "I am excited, Papa. But sometimes it feels like I have to hide that excitement behind all these rules and proper behaviors. Sometimes I wonder if the real me is good enough for these important people, or if they only want to meet the prince version of me." The question hit William like a physical blow. It was exactly the struggle he had faced throughout his own childhood and adolescence, the constant tension between authentic self-expression and royal duty. He had hoped to spare his children that particular burden, but here it was, manifesting in his 10-year-old son with heartbreaking clarity. Charles, who had been quietly observing, stepped closer to his grandson. "George, the most important thing to remember is that being a good prince means being a good person first. The protocols and ceremonies are just the framework. What makes them meaningful is the genuine care and respect you bring to each interaction." As the rehearsal concluded for the day, staff members began clearing away the practice materials and rearranging the furniture. George sat quietly on his cushion, looking smaller somehow in the vast room. The weight of tomorrow's responsibilities seemed to press down on his young shoulders like an invisible crown. William approached his son, kneeling once again to meet him at eye level. "You've done excellent work today, George. I'm very proud of how seriously you're taking your responsibilities." "Thank you, Papa," George replied politely, but there was something distant in his expression, as if he had already begun the process of transformation from boy to prince that would be required for tomorrow's performance. The family made their way through the castle's corridors toward their private quarters, where Catherine would be waiting with Charlotte and Louis, probably helping with homework or reading bedtime stories. The contrast between the formal rehearsal they were leaving and the warm family life awaiting them highlighted the dual existence that royal children must navigate from an early age. Tomorrow would bring the actual event, with its cameras, protocols, and the weight of national representation. Tonight, however, George would still be able to be simply a boy, even as his dreams would likely be filled with bows, handshakes, and carefully rehearsed conversations. The transformation of a child into a future king was a gradual process, but moments like these marked clear steps along that irreversible journey. The next morning arrived with the crisp efficiency that characterized all major royal events. By 7 o'clock, Windsor Castle hummed with activity as staff members made final preparations for the evening's state dinner. Florists arranged elaborate displays in the state dining room, while the kitchen staff began preparations for a meal that would need to accommodate diverse dietary requirements and cultural sensitivities from 12 different nations. George woke to the familiar sounds of a household preparing for royal duty. Even in their private quarters, the family could hear the distant murmur of increased activity, the careful footsteps of staff moving with purpose through corridors that would soon welcome some of the world's most important dignitaries. The boy lay in bed for a few extra minutes, staring at the ceiling and mentally rehearsing the evening's protocols. At breakfast, Catherine noticed her eldest son's unusual quietness. While Charlotte chattered about her upcoming art class and Louis attempted to build a tower with his cereal pieces, George ate methodically, his mind clearly elsewhere. His school uniform was perfectly pressed, his hair neatly combed, but there was a thoughtfulness in his demeanor that seemed older than his years. "How are you feeling about tonight?" Catherine asked gently, reaching over to squeeze George's hand. Her touch was warm and reassuring, a reminder that beneath all the royal protocol, he was still her little boy who needed encouragement and support. "I think I'm ready," George replied carefully. "Papa and I practiced everything yesterday. I know exactly what to do and what to say." His words were confident, but Catherine detected an underlying uncertainty that only a mother would notice. William joined them for breakfast, already dressed in his day clothes but clearly mentally preparing for the evening ahead. State dinners require days of preparation, and, as heir apparent, much of the responsibility for ensuring smooth diplomatic relations fell on his shoulders. The pressure was immense, made more complex by the knowledge that George would be participating for the first time in such a significant event. "Remember," William said as he sat down with his coffee, "tonight isn't just about following protocol perfectly. It's about representing our values as a family and, as a nation. The guests will be watching how we interact with each other as much as how we interact with them." George nodded solemnly, understanding that his behavior would be observed and analyzed not just by the guests present, but by the media and public who would read about every detail in tomorrow's newspapers. The weight of representing an entire nation at the age of 10 was an extraordinary burden, one that few children could comprehend or handle. After breakfast, George attended his regular tutoring session, but his concentration wavered. His history tutor, Mr. Pemberton, noticed the boys' distraction and gently suggested they review the historical context of state dinners rather than continuing with their planned lesson on medieval England. "State dinners have been a tradition for centuries," Mr. Pemberton explained, sensing that understanding the historical significance might help calm George's nerves. "They're not just social events, but opportunities for nations to strengthen relationships, discuss important issues, and demonstrate mutual respect." George listened intently, his analytical mind engaging with the concept that tonight's dinner was part of a long tradition of diplomacy. Understanding the historical context helped him see beyond the immediate pressure of perfect performance to the larger significance of international relations and peaceful dialogue between nations. As the afternoon approached, preparations at the castle intensified. Security teams conducted final sweeps of all areas that guests would access. Protocol officers reviewed seating arrangements one final time, ensuring that cultural sensitivities and diplomatic hierarchies were properly respected. The state dining room was transformed into a showcase of British hospitality, with the finest china, crystal, and silverware arranged with mathematical precision. George spent the afternoon in relative quiet, reading in the library while the chaos of preparation swirled around him. He had chosen a book about different cultures and customs, wanting to have genuine conversation topics ready for his interactions with the international guests. His natural curiosity about the world served him well in this regard, as his questions would come from authentic interest rather than rehearsed politeness. At 3 o'clock, George joined William for a final, brief rehearsal. This time, they focused not on specific protocols but on remaining calm and confident under pressure. William shared some of his own experiences from early state events, including mistakes he had made and lessons he had learned. "When I was about your age," William confided, "I once forgot the name of an important guest and panicked. Instead of pretending I remembered, I simply said, 'I'm terribly sorry, but could you remind me of your name? I want to make sure I address you properly.' The guest was actually impressed by my honesty and consideration." These personal stories helped George understand that perfection wasn't expected, even from royalty. What mattered was genuine effort, respect for others, and the ability to handle mistakes with grace and dignity. This perspective shift was exactly what the boy needed to transform his nervous energy into confident anticipation. By 4 o'clock, the first guests began arriving for pre-dinner receptions in various drawing rooms. George could hear the distant sounds of cars arriving, security protocols being enacted, and the formal greetings taking place in other parts of the castle. The boy felt a familiar flutter of nervous excitement, the same feeling he experienced before school plays or important examinations. Catherine helped him into his formal evening wear, a miniature version of adult diplomatic attire that had been custom-tailored for the occasion. The clothing felt different from his usual school uniform or casual clothes, more substantial, more serious, imbued with the weight of tradition and expectation. Looking in the mirror, George saw not just himself, but a young representative of centuries of royal tradition. "You look very handsome and very dignified," Catherine said, adjusting his tie one final time. "But, remember, underneath all this formality, you're still my sweet, curious, intelligent son. Don't let the ceremony make you forget who you are." Her words were exactly what George needed to hear. The reminder that his authentic self was valuable and worthy helped counterbalance the pressure to perform a perfect royal role. He smiled at his reflection, seeing both the formal young prince and the ordinary boy who loved football and space documentaries. As the family gathered before making their entrance to the state dining room, George took deep breaths and mentally reviewed not just the protocols he had practiced, but also the genuine interests and questions he hoped to explore with the international guests. He thought about the ambassador from Japan's space program, wondered about cultural traditions from African nations, and hoped to learn something new about different educational systems around the world. The moment arrived for their formal entrance. As they walked through the castle's grand corridors toward the state dining room, George could hear the murmur of conversation from dozens of distinguished guests. Photography flashes illuminated the evening air, and the formal announcements of their arrival echoed through the ancient halls. Standing at the entrance to the state dining room, George looked up at his father and grandfather, seeing in their faces the same mixture of nervous energy and determined confidence that he felt in himself. This was what royal service meant, putting aside personal comfort to fulfill duties that were larger than any individual, representing ideals of service, diplomacy, and international cooperation. William placed a reassuring hand on George's shoulder as they prepared to enter. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "Yes, Papa," George replied, his voice clear and steady. "I'm ready to represent our family and our country with honor." The doors opened, and the royal family stepped into a room filled with representatives from around the world, each guest eager to meet the young prince who represented the future of the British monarchy. George walked with measured steps, his posture perfect, his expression combining appropriate dignity with natural warmth. The evening's first protocol was the receiving line, where George would meet each guest individually. As he had practiced countless times, he offered firm handshakes, made appropriate eye contact, and spoke clearly when introducing himself. But, unlike the rehearsals, these interactions carried the electricity of real diplomatic significance. The ambassador from France, an elegant woman with kind eyes, smiled warmly when introduced to George. "Your Highness, it's a pleasure to meet you. I understand you're learning French in school." "Yes, Your Excellency," George replied, grateful for a conversation topic he felt confident about. "I find languages fascinating. Perhaps you could tell me about some of the regional dialects in France? I'd love to learn about the differences between Parisian French and other regional variations." His genuine curiosity and thoughtful question impressed the ambassador, who launched into an engaging explanation that had George listening with authentic interest. William watched with pride as his son navigated this real diplomatic conversation with both protocol correctness and genuine intellectual engagement. As the receiving line continued, George found his confidence growing. Each interaction was unique, presenting opportunities to learn about different countries, cultures, and perspectives. His natural intelligence and curiosity served him well, allowing him to move beyond rehearsed responses to actual conversations. The German ambassador mentioned environmental initiatives his country was implementing, which sparked George's interest in renewable energy projects. The representative from Kenya spoke about educational programs for rural children, which connected to George's own experiences with tutoring and learning. Each conversation became a small window into the wider world, exactly what William had hoped would happen. However, as the formal dinner progressed, the complexity of managing multiple conversations while maintaining perfect protocol began to take its toll. George found himself needing to split his attention between genuine interest in what guests were saying and constant awareness of proper behavior, seating arrangements, and the subtle diplomatic undercurrents flowing through every interaction. During the main course, seated between a minister from Australia and an ambassador from Brazil, George attempted to engage both guests in conversation while carefully following the intricate rules of formal dining. The mental effort was exhausting, requiring him to monitor his posture, his eating pace, his conversation topics, and his responses to various toasts and formal remarks. By the time dessert was served, George had been on for nearly 3 hours, maintaining perfect diplomatic behavior while processing complex international discussions that touched on everything from trade relationships to cultural exchanges. His mind felt stretched to its limits, managing information and interactions at a level far beyond what any 10-year-old should reasonably be expected to handle. As the evening drew toward its conclusion, with final toasts being offered and guests beginning to make their polite departures, George felt a profound exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. It was the mental and emotional fatigue that comes from extended periods of intense performance, when every word and gesture carries significant weight and consequences. Walking through the receiving line for final farewells, George maintained his composure and appropriate responses, but William could see the strain in his son's eyes. The boy had performed admirably, exceeding every expectation and representing the family with genuine honor and dignity. But the cost of such performance was becoming clear in the subtle signs of exhaustion that only a parent would notice. As the last guests departed and the family finally had a moment alone, George stood quietly in the state dining room, looking around at the remnants of the evening's formal grandeur. The contrast between the high energy of diplomatic performance and the sudden quiet of conclusion left him feeling somewhat disoriented, as if waking from an intense dream. Tomorrow there would be newspaper articles analyzing every aspect of the evening, including detailed observations about the young prince's debut performance at such a significant diplomatic event. But, tonight, in the quiet aftermath, George was simply a tired 10-year-old who had successfully navigated one of the most challenging experiences of his young life. The morning after the state dinner brought both relief and reflection. George woke later than usual, his body and mind recovering from the intensive evening of diplomatic performance. Sunlight streamed through his bedroom windows, carrying with it the ordinary sounds of castle life returning to its regular rhythm after the extraordinary demands of hosting international dignitaries. At breakfast, the family gathered around their private dining table, a stark contrast to the formal grandeur of the previous evening's state dining room. Charlotte and Louis were full of questions about the dinner, having heard whispered conversations among staff about how well their older brother had performed. Their innocent curiosity provided a welcome return to normal family dynamics after hours of carefully managed diplomatic interactions. "Did you really meet someone from every continent?" Charlotte asked excitedly, her eyes wide with the kind of wonder that George remembered feeling before such events became responsibilities rather than adventures. "Almost every continent," George replied, managing a tired smile. "The Antarctic Research Station didn't send a representative." His attempt at humor was gentle, reflecting his growing understanding that his siblings still saw these events through the lens of childhood excitement rather than duty and obligation. William studied his eldest son carefully, noting the subtle signs of emotional exhaustion that lingered despite a full night's sleep. The boy's responses were appropriate and kind, but there was a quality of measured consideration in his words that hadn't been present before the dinner. It was as if the evening had added another layer of awareness about the weight of royal representation. Catherine, with her keen maternal instincts, recognized that George needed space to process the previous evening's experiences. Rather than pressing him with questions about his performance or feelings, she simply maintained normal family routines, allowing him to return gradually to the comfortable rhythms of childhood within their private sphere. The morning newspapers, as expected, carried extensive coverage of the state dinner. Photographs showed George in various moments of the evening, shaking hands with dignitaries, engaged in conversation, walking with perfect posture through receiving lines. The articles praised his poise, intelligence, and natural diplomatic ability, but reading about himself as a public figure rather than simply as a person created an odd sense of disconnection for the 10-year-old. "Look at this," William said, showing George a particularly positive article that described his interactions with various ambassadors as remarkably sophisticated for such a young representative of the crown. While the praise was gratifying, it also emphasized the public nature of what had felt like very personal interactions the evening before. George read the articles with interest, but also with growing awareness of how differently the outside world perceived these events compared to his own internal experience. The journalists wrote about his confidence and natural ability, but they couldn't capture the mental exhaustion, the constant self-monitoring, or the effort required to maintain appropriate behavior for such extended periods. By late morning, George had returned to his regular tutoring schedule, but both he and his instructors found it difficult to concentrate on ordinary academic subjects after the intensity of real-world diplomatic engagement. Mathematics problems seemed almost trivial compared to navigating international relations, and literature discussions felt removed from the immediate reality of representing national interests. Mr. Pemberton, his history tutor, wisely decided to use the recent experience as a teaching opportunity. "Now that you've participated in a state dinner yourself," he said, "perhaps you can better understand the historical significance of diplomatic gatherings throughout British history. How do you think your experience compares to what young royals might have felt centuries ago?" This approach engaged George's analytical mind while helping him process his recent experiences within a larger historical context. He began to see the previous evening not just as a personal challenge successfully overcome, but as part of a long tradition of young royals gradually assuming greater responsibilities as they prepared for future leadership roles. During his lunch break, George chose to spend time alone in the castle gardens, seeking the peace and normalcy of natural surroundings after the artificial intensity of formal diplomatic performance. Walking among familiar paths and seasonal flowers, he tried to reconcile the two versions of himself, the ordinary boy who enjoyed football and adventure stories, and the young prince who could engage in sophisticated conversations with world leaders. The afternoon brought an unexpected challenge when his private secretary informed him that several international media outlets were requesting brief interviews about his experience at the state dinner. While such attention was flattering and could provide valuable public relations benefits for the monarchy, it also represented another layer of performance and public scrutiny that George wasn't sure he was ready to handle. William approached this request with careful consideration of his son's emotional state and developmental needs. The previous evening had already pushed George far beyond normal childhood experiences, and additional media attention could amplify the pressure rather than allowing natural recovery time. "We don't have to accept any interview requests," William assured his son. "Your participation in the dinner was your contribution. You don't owe the media anything beyond that." George appreciated this protection, but he also recognized that declining all media attention might be seen as avoiding responsibility or lacking confidence in his performance. The complexity of balancing personal needs with public expectations was becoming increasingly apparent as another aspect of royal life that required careful navigation. After extensive family discussion, they decided to accept one brief, carefully structured interview with a respected royal correspondent who was known for sensitivity when working with young members of the family. The interview would focus on George's educational interests and how meeting international representatives had expanded his understanding of different cultures, rather than detailed analysis of diplomatic protocols or political implications. Preparing for this interview required almost as much mental energy as preparing for the state dinner itself. George needed to articulate his experiences in ways that were honest and authentic while avoiding any statements that could be misinterpreted or create diplomatic complications. The balance between childlike enthusiasm and royal discretion was delicate and demanding. The interview took place in one of the castle's more informal sitting rooms, designed to create a comfortable atmosphere that might help George feel more relaxed. However, the presence of cameras, recording equipment, and multiple staff members monitoring every word created an environment that felt anything but casual or natural. "Your Royal Highness," the correspondent began gently, "can you tell us what surprised you most about meeting representatives from so many different countries?" George considered the question carefully before responding. "I was surprised by how much we had in common despite coming from very different places. Everyone seemed genuinely interested in learning about each other's countries and finding ways to work together on important issues like environmental protection and education." His answer demonstrated both diplomatic wisdom and authentic observation, but delivering it required the same kind of careful self-monitoring that had characterized the entire state dinner experience. Even in this supposedly relaxed setting, George found himself constantly evaluating his words and expressions to ensure they conveyed appropriate messages. The interview continued with questions about his studies, his interests in different cultures, and his thoughts on the importance of international friendship. George handled each question competently, but the cumulative effect of another extended period of careful public performance added to his growing sense of emotional fatigue. When the interview concluded and the media team departed, George felt a complex mixture of relief and accomplishment. He had successfully navigated another challenging aspect of public royal life, but the effort required was becoming increasingly apparent as something fundamentally different from ordinary childhood experiences. That evening, as the family gathered for a private dinner in their personal quarters, the contrast with the previous night's formal grandeur was striking. Simple food, comfortable clothes, and unguarded conversation provided a welcome return to authentic family relationships after days of managed public performance. Charlotte and Louis were full of stories about their own day's activities, art projects, playground games, and the kind of innocent adventures that characterized normal childhood. Listening to them, George felt both nostalgic for the simplicity of their experiences and grateful for his own expanding understanding of the wider world. Catherine noticed that George seemed quieter than usual, more thoughtful in his responses to family conversation. While his behavior was perfectly appropriate, there was a quality of careful consideration that suggested he was still processing the complex emotions and experiences of recent days. "How are you feeling about everything that's happened this week?" she asked gently when they had a moment alone together. George considered the question seriously before responding. "I'm proud that I represented our family well, and I learned so much about different countries and cultures. But it's also exhausting to think so carefully about every word and action for such long periods. I wonder if it gets easier with experience, or if it's always this mentally demanding." His thoughtful analysis demonstrated remarkable maturity and self-awareness, but it also revealed the very adult nature of the challenges he was already facing at such a young age. The questions he was grappling with, about authentic self-expression versus public duty, about managing exhaustion while maintaining performance standards, about balancing personal needs with national representation, were complex issues that most people don't encounter until much later in life. As bedtime approached, George spent extra time reading before sleep, seeking comfort in stories that transported him to imaginary worlds where young heroes faced challenges through courage and kindness rather than protocol and diplomatic precision. The familiar rhythms of adventure stories provided mental relief after days of navigating real-world complexities that carried genuine consequences for international relations. Lying in bed that night, George reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. He had successfully proven his ability to handle significant royal responsibilities, earning praise from family members, staff, and media observers. But, he had also discovered that such success came at a considerable personal cost in terms of energy, spontaneity, and simple childhood pleasures. Tomorrow would bring a return to normal routines, tutoring sessions, family time, and the comfortable predictability of private royal life. But, George now carried with him a deeper understanding of what his future held, both the privileges and the burdens of royal service that would gradually expand as he grew toward eventual kingship. The state dinner and its aftermath had marked a significant milestone in his development from protected child to public figure. While he had handled the transition with remarkable grace and competence, the experience had also illuminated the ongoing tension between personal authenticity and royal duty that would likely characterize much of his future life. As sleep finally came, George's dreams mixed memories of diplomatic conversations with fantasies of simpler adventures, reflecting his mind's attempt to integrate extraordinary recent experiences with the ordinary desires and imagination that remained fundamentally unchanged despite his growing public responsibilities. The boy who had successfully represented his nation on the international stage was still, in many essential ways, simply a 10-year-old trying to understand his place in an increasingly complex world. The challenge for his family would be helping him navigate that complexity while preserving the curiosity, kindness, and authentic spirit that made him not just an effective royal representative, but a remarkable human being in his own right. 3 weeks after the state dinner, life at Windsor Castle had settled back into familiar patterns, but subtle changes lingered in the way George approached his daily responsibilities. The successful diplomatic debut had given him increased confidence in formal situations, yet it had also heightened his awareness of the complex balance between public duty and private authenticity that would define much of his future life. The morning brought news of another upcoming royal event, a Commonwealth Youth Forum where George would meet young leaders from around the world. Unlike the state dinner's focus on adult diplomacy, this event would connect him with peers who were also grappling with leadership responsibilities in their respective countries, albeit in different contexts than royal succession. William found his son in the library, surrounded by books about various Commonwealth nations. George's approach to preparation had evolved since the state dinner. Rather than focusing primarily on protocol, he was now researching the substantive issues and cultural contexts that might arise in conversations. This shift from procedural learning to intellectual engagement represented significant growth in his understanding of effective royal service. "I've been reading about the education initiatives in New Zealand," George said, looking up from a report about innovative teaching methods in rural communities. "Did you know they're using virtual reality to connect students in remote areas with museums and laboratories around the world? I'd love to ask their youth representative about how technology is changing educational opportunities." William smiled, recognizing in his son's enthusiasm the same curiosity that had always characterized George's approach to learning. The state dinner experience hadn't diminished that natural intellectual engagement, instead, it had given him a framework for channeling his interests into meaningful diplomatic conversations. "That's exactly the kind of substantive discussion that makes these events valuable," William replied. "You're learning to use your genuine interests as bridges to understanding different perspectives and approaches to common challenges." The preparation for the Commonwealth Youth Forum proceeded differently than the intensive protocol training that had preceded the state dinner. While proper etiquette remained important, the emphasis shifted toward understanding contemporary issues facing young people globally: climate change, educational access, economic opportunity, and social justice initiatives. George found this preparation more engaging and less exhausting than the previous formal training. Rather than memorizing diplomatic scripts, he was exploring ideas and developing informed opinions that he could share authentically during discussions. This approach felt more natural and sustainable than the careful performance that had characterized the state dinner. Catherine noticed the difference in her son's demeanor as he prepared for this new event. While he remained serious about his responsibilities, there was less anxiety and more genuine excitement about the learning opportunities the forum would provide. The shift suggested that George was developing his own approach to royal engagement, one that emphasized intellectual curiosity and authentic connection over purely ceremonial performance. The day of the Commonwealth Youth Forum arrived with less fanfare than the state dinner, but with no less significance for George's continuing development as a future leader. The setting was less formal, a modern conference center rather than the ancient grandeur of Windsor Castle, and the atmosphere was designed to encourage open discussion rather than ceremonial protocol. George arrived dressed in smart casual attire that reflected the forum's emphasis on substance over ceremony. Meeting the other young participants, he immediately noticed how their energy and perspectives differed from the seasoned diplomats he had encountered at the state dinner. These were peers who shared some of his own experiences with responsibility and public attention, though in very different contexts. The opening session introduced participants from across the Commonwealth: a teenage climate activist from the Caribbean, a young entrepreneur from Kenya developing educational apps, a student leader from Australia working on Indigenous rights issues, and a technology innovator from Canada creating solutions for rural healthcare access. Each brought unique perspectives shaped by their particular cultural backgrounds and national challenges. George found himself genuinely fascinated by their stories and initiatives. Unlike the carefully managed conversations at the state dinner, these discussions felt more spontaneous and intellectually stimulating. He could ask questions driven by authentic curiosity rather than diplomatic necessity, and he could share his own thoughts without constant concern about protocol violations. During a breakout session on educational innovation, George engaged in an animated discussion with representatives from several countries about how traditional learning methods were being transformed by technology. His questions about the New Zealand virtual reality programs led to broader conversations about equalizing educational opportunities across geographic and economic divides. "In Brunei, we're facing similar challenges with reaching students in remote areas," explained a teenage participant named Asha. "We're experimenting with satellite internet connections to enable real-time video learning. What educational challenges are you most interested in addressing in the United Kingdom?" The question gave George an opportunity to share his own observations about educational inequality he had learned about through his family's charitable work. Unlike the state dinner, where such topics required careful diplomatic navigation, this conversation felt like natural peer-to-peer learning and idea sharing. "I've been visiting schools in different parts of Britain, and I've seen how geography and family income can create very different educational experiences," George replied thoughtfully. "I'm particularly interested in how technology might help level those differences, but also how we make sure that technological solutions don't leave behind students who don't have access to devices or reliable internet." His response demonstrated both genuine concern and informed understanding, reflecting the kind of substantive engagement that characterized effective leadership rather than ceremonial representation. The other participants responded with similar thoughtfulness, sharing their own observations and innovative approaches to similar challenges. As the forum continued through workshops on climate action, economic development, and social justice, George discovered that his royal platform could be a tool for amplifying important issues rather than simply maintaining traditional ceremonies. The young leaders he was meeting were using whatever influence and resources they had access to create positive change in their communities and countries. During a lunch break, George found himself in conversation with Marcus, a 17-year-old from Jamaica who had developed a youth mentorship program connecting urban and rural teenagers through shared environmental projects. Their discussion revealed common concerns about young people feeling disconnected from traditional political processes while being deeply engaged with specific social and environmental issues. Sometimes I think adults underestimate how much young people care about these big global problems, Marcus observed. We may not express it through traditional political channels, but we're finding our own ways to make a difference. George nodded, recognizing truth in this observation. His own experience with formal royal duties sometimes felt disconnected from the urgent contemporary issues that genuinely concerned him. The Commonwealth Forum was showing him possibilities for using his position to engage with substantive challenges rather than simply maintaining ceremonial traditions. The afternoon session focused on collaborative project planning, with participants working together to develop initiatives that could connect their different countries and communities around shared goals. George found himself energized by the creative problem-solving and genuine partnership that emerged from these discussions. Working with a group developing a Commonwealth-wide youth exchange program focused on sustainable agriculture, George contributed ideas about how such exchanges could be supported and promoted through existing royal charitable networks. His suggestions were received as valuable contributions rather than ceremonial endorsements, reflecting the authentic collaboration that the forum had fostered. As the event drew to a close, participants exchanged contact information and made commitments to continue their conversations and collaborations beyond the formal forum structure. George realized that this event had given him something the state dinner had not: genuine peer relationships with other young people who understood the challenges and opportunities of leadership responsibility. During the closing ceremony, each participant was invited to share one key insight from their forum experience. When George's turn came, he spoke from the heart rather than from diplomatic training. "I've learned that leadership isn't just about maintaining traditions or following protocols," he said. "It's about listening to different perspectives, understanding real challenges that people face, and finding ways to contribute to positive change. I'm grateful to have met all of you, and I hope we can continue working together on issues that matter to our generation." His words reflected genuine personal growth and a clearer understanding of how he wanted to approach his future royal responsibilities. The applause from his fellow participants felt different from the polite acknowledgement he had received at the state dinner. This felt like recognition from peers who shared his commitment to meaningful service. The ride back to Windsor Castle gave George time to reflect on how differently this event had affected him compared to the state dinner. While both had been successful in their own ways, the Commonwealth Youth Forum had left him feeling energized and inspired rather than exhausted and overwhelmed. The difference lay in the opportunity for authentic engagement versus ceremonial performance. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, George shared his experiences with enthusiasm that had been missing from his post-state dinner conversations. He told them about the innovative projects his new colleagues were developing, the collaborative solutions they had explored together, and the ongoing partnerships he hoped to maintain. William listened with growing recognition that his son was developing his own vision for royal service, one that honored traditional responsibilities while embracing contemporary relevance and authentic engagement. This evolution represented healthy growth rather than rejection of royal duties. "It sounds like you're discovering ways to make royal responsibility feel meaningful and sustainable," William observed. "That's exactly what each generation of royals needs to accomplish, finding their own authentic approach to service." Catherine noticed how animated and genuinely happy George seemed when discussing the forum experiences. The contrast with his post-state dinner exhaustion was striking and encouraging. It suggested that George was finding ways to engage with his royal role that energized rather than depleted him. "I think I understand better now what kind of prince I want to be," George said thoughtfully. "Not just someone who follows protocols perfectly, but someone who uses the platform and opportunities that come with this position to support important work that other young people are doing around the world. This insight represented a significant milestone in George's development as a future leader. Rather than seeing royal duty as a burden to be endured or a performance to be perfected, he was beginning to understand it as a tool for amplifying meaningful work and supporting positive change. Later that evening, alone in his room, George began writing in a journal that he had started keeping since the state dinner. Tonight's entry was different from the earlier ones that had focused on protocol analysis and performance evaluation. Instead, he wrote about ideas, connections, and possibilities for future collaboration with the young leaders he had met. The experience of the Commonwealth Youth Forum had shown him a path forward that honored both his royal heritage and his personal values. Rather than choosing between authentic self-expression and royal duty, he was discovering ways to integrate both into a form of service that felt both meaningful and sustainable. As he prepared for sleep, George felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing since his formal introduction to major royal responsibilities. The state dinner had proven his ability to meet traditional expectations, but the Commonwealth Youth Forum had revealed possibilities for exceeding those expectations in ways that could create genuine positive impact. Tomorrow would bring return to normal routines, but George now carried with him a clearer vision of what his future royal service might become, not just maintenance of tradition, but active engagement with the challenges and opportunities of his generation. The young prince was discovering that the most powerful thing he could say wasn't a perfectly rehearsed diplomatic response, but a simple truth: I am here tomorrow, committed to using whatever influence and platform he inherited in service of creating a better future for everyone.